We are live.
We are live. Okay. It says I'm going to welcome you and give open remarks. I'm not going to say anything except this is a horribly long agenda. We asked what we thought were some simple questions. And are we into 54 slides? Yeah. So what seemed like we gave joint fiscal, Julia and Graham, who I see is up on the screen, just some modeling to do. They couldn't get it done by last week, thus we canceled the meeting. It turned out to be a lot more complex than I think we thought. So I'm going to try and move us through this as quickly as we can. And I'm going to start out with, I guess, Julia, Graham, this is your dog and pony show. So
We have to pick a time for our next meeting first.
we have to pick a time for our next meeting first.
Like we need to schedule one meeting.
It's what, December 10th?
I got to go find my
We
phone.
were later than that.
We have to add a meeting date.
We have to add a meeting date. That's the sentence.
Can we
Thank
do
you.
that like at lunch?
Get to that.
We get to.
Yes.
We get to schedule another meeting
Right.
date. Sure, yeah.
Okay, yeah, let's do that at lunch and then I can find my phone, which yesterday I lost that caused panic.
16th we're scheduled. December.
It was here this morning. It's not here now. I may have taken it out. Okay, so Julia, in slides 1 through 5
Yes,
in 5 minutes?
we'll see. For the record, I'm Julia Richter with the Joint Fiscal Office. And as Chair Cummings mentioned, we have a lot to go through today. So we've divvied it up into, looking at slide 2 here, divvied it up into a number of sections that hopefully will be more easy to digest. So we can talk about each section and then at the end, talk about the options as a whole. So we've got this slide deck. I know that Sorsha printed them out. Does everyone have the slide deck in front of them?
I do not. I gotta find it.
Do you want the hard copy?
It's also printed for folks watching on YouTube.
Yeah,
I have
hard
a
copy is
line.
better. Okay,
I mean,
it's, my computer doesn't hold for any amount of time. Okay, let's go.
okay. So I'm on slide 2 here, the outline. We're really just going to walk through each section individually. And then at the end, have a bigger picture look. But just to start things out in terms of general remarks, I'm on slide 3.
It isn't possible to share. I'm just thinking if people at home can't see any of these, if anyone is watching.
Sure, would you like,
Well, they can pull it up from the website.
They can pull it up? Okay, so anyone that wants to see it, it is on the website. That's the Joint Fiscal website,
the committee page?
committee page. Okay, so anyone that wants to pull up all of the 54 slides can do that. Okay.
So in terms of just big picture, setting the stage, we were asked by the committee in the October 26th meeting to look into 2 specific options for an education income tax. And that's what we're going to be talking about here today. And these options are structured to replace the entire net homestead tax. So looking at here, slide 3, you can see the box around the net homestead property tax. So that is the homestead property tax with the income adjustments netted out. That is a policy decision, but we've modeled it that way based on the committee's feedback. And the other assumption is that all other funding sources in the ed fund remain the same. So the sales and use, non-homestead property tax, meals and rooms, all of that has been modeled to be the same. So we're really just talking about this green chunk on the right in the red box. So I'm on slide 4 now. And before really diving into the nitty gritty, I think it's helpful to talk about 2 of the sort of really big picture questions that we were coming up with consistently as we were going through our modeling efforts. And it really does seem to come back to these two big questions. Of course, there are a number of other questions that policymakers need to consider, but when looking at the slide deck today, these are kind of the two big questions. The first being, who should pay the direct education tax? So we'll be talking a lot about shifting of tax incidence and tax responsibility. And so thinking about who should be responsible for that direct education tax. Should it be everyone in the state who makes an income, or should it only be property owners? Right, so we'll be shifting from the homestead property owners to residents who make an income. So the other big question is, should some groups have more or less skin in the game? In other words, how and to what extent should direct education taxes be connected to local spending decisions? So those are kind of the two big themes that are just going to probably keep coming up throughout the different sections.
Okay. Anybody has any questions, just
Of
pop up
course,
at any.
please just hit me with questions. We've got a lot to go through, and especially here in the beginning, a lot of our later slides build on what I'm talking about now. So it's really important to understand at this stage everything so that we can get those big picture takeaways later in the day. And we have to talk about some notes about the modeling. It was conducted by us at JFO as well as the JFO consultant, Deb Brighton, and we were using mismatched and imperfect data sets. So I do just want to put that caveat out there. While we can grab some big picture takeaways, some of the specific numbers need to be taken with a very large grain of salt. JFO, we use the Chambridge income tax model to estimate total income tax revenue and examine the effects of the income tax on the entire population. And Deb Brighton used rates modeled by us to analyze the impact on homeowners using a data set that looks at homeowners and household income and or AGI, dependent on where they fall within the income spectrum. And so this mismatch comes with caveats. As I just mentioned, AGI and household income aren't the same as we've spoken about earlier. So earlier in these meetings. So it is difficult to compare across groups. It's difficult to understand because we don't have, because the data sets are mismatched, it's difficult to compare, property owners and non-property owners because we're working with two different data sets. And also the caveat that we use data from 2019 to be consistent with past modeling efforts and have grown it forward to 2022. So we have a better understanding of where we are at now. We use similar growth equations, but not the exact same. So those are just my caveats to keep in mind and just be aware of when interpreting the numbers.
A question about your caveat, Julie.
Yes.
Sorry. I think I had I just realized this yesterday, that I had this assumption that when we tasked tax with the study that they did over the summer, that they would be combining those data sets for us as part of the study. And I'm happy to ask Jake about this later this afternoon, what happened, but do you have a sense of if they've made any progress on that or what?
I think that would be a good question to ask Jake about. Due to privacy regulations, there are certain data sets that I am legally obliged to work with and others that I'm not. So because of that, we can only go so far. And it would be a question for tax as to what extent can they move this modeling further or not. I don't know. I don't want to speak to them.
Thanks.
Okay, does anyone have any other questions about all of my big disclaimers before diving in? Okay, not seeing any. Moving on to section B. And this is the structures of the two options that the committee was talking about at the end of the October 26th meeting. So we've titled them for clarity, option 1 and option 2. There's no meaning there other than option 1 is the first one that the committee asked about and option 2 is the second. So I'm first going to walk through the structure of option 1, and please interrupt with any questions as I'm moving forward about the structures. So I'm on slide 7 here. Big picture, option 1 would add a statewide education income tax that's not tied to local spending decisions, and it would maintain a minimal homestead property tax. So what would the minimal homestead property tax look like? It would be adjusted, excuse me, it would be adjusted by local spending decisions. So it would follow the same construct that the homestead property tax currently follows, with the exception that there would no longer be income sensitivity. So we would have this minimal homestead property tax, and we would remove the property tax credit and the education fund circuit breaker. Because of the education income tax that I'll talk about in a second, the homestead property tax would need to raise a lot less than it does currently. That's why we're referring to it as a minimal homestead property tax. And I want to note that many of the homestead owning households and individuals would pay an income tax, the education income tax, and that would be what's offsetting the homestead property tax to bring it down. And then the other option 1 would be to add an education income tax to the ed fund. This tax would have progressive income brackets. We'll go in the next slides what those brackets might look like. It would be a tax on resident adjusted gross income. All individuals and households who file a personal income tax return would be responsible for paying this direct education income tax. And as I mentioned earlier, the revenues from the education income tax would offset the amount that needs to be raised by homestead property taxes.
Senator Pearson.
Bullet 3 and 4 seem to contradict. Is there, if it's a resident, but there are people that file personal income tax returns who are not residents. And so are you excluding them?
Yes.
Okay.
Based on the committee's, what we interpreted from the committee's request that this would be a tax on resident AGI.
That was not my request, certainly. I think that's a very interesting point, and I'd love to understand the line between them, but I certainly never would have asked for that. I think that's actually a benefit would be to look at what assessing it is on everyone who files, but anyway.
That might be a question for Jake, right? How many there are and.
Yeah.
At least understanding that decision point, because I think a broader base has a lot of advantages.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to ask a similar question because I would agree with what Senator Pearson just said. So the second bullet point where it says tax on resident, that being bolded and italicized, that was just your understanding of a decision that the committee made, not because it's easier because of the data sets or that we can't tax non-residents or something like that.
I did see Graham pop up. Graham, I don't know if you wanted to chime in.
Yeah, so Graham Campbell from the Joint Fiscal Office. Yeah, so that's correct, Senator Perchik. We interpreted the committee's request as a tax on resident AGI. And I would say first, speaking to Senator Pearson's, Julia will get into sort of the amount of money we're talking about here, but it's about $400 million on residents here that we're going to be raising, and adding non-residents to it does not increase the money significantly. We're talking, I think if I remember right, somewhere around $20 to $30 million extra from non-residents. And I think the other thing that the committee should consider here is that the sort of somewhat difficult thing with looking at non-residents here is that when you're using a tax base like AGI is what gets fed into the brackets, all right? And people pay the tax rate based upon what their AGI is. But then for a non-resident, you'd have to apportion that based upon the share of their income that's coming from Vermont. So we had this issue with H911 a couple of years ago, where people who are non-residents who made, let's say, $10 million were having their income fed through the brackets at $10 million. And so they were generating a lot of tax, but then the apportionment percentage was being applied to the tax afterwards. which is similar to how it works in PIT. But what it was sort of a different sort of way of doing it slightly with respect to the current personal income tax, where the taxable income goes in. So it's slightly different. AGI is such a broad measure of income that there are, I think, policy considerations about whether you should, or how you should handle apportionment with a tax that's purely on AGI. So the fact that we did modeling on residents here sort of gets around that problem. As I said, it's not a huge amount of income, but there is, I think, a policy consideration around apportionment that the committee would have to address if you decide to loop in non-residents to this tax.
Can you say the ballpark number one more time for how much it would be?
I'm speaking from memory here, but it was, I think it was like $20 to $30 million extra. We have, I think, about 325,000-ish resident tax returns, typically, something like that, and then about 50 to 60,000 non-resident tax returns that come in.
Graham, is that 20 to 30,000 million the total income, or is that the apportioned
That's the amount of income that would be raised for, at least for option one here that we're going to be talking about. That's the amount of revenue that would have been raised if you had looped in non-residents as well. So another roughly, 8 to 10% more revenue.
Pay for universal meals.
Yeah.
Okay, I think let's walk it through, and I've got that flagged as a question we're going to come back to. That can go on our parking lot or whatever we're calling it. Okay.
So, so looking at option one, we've got the minimal homestead property tax. We've got the education income tax on resident AGI with brackets, and then all of the revenue streams would stay the same, including non-homestead property taxes. Are there any other questions about the big picture structure?
Well, I guess I'm still confused on the point that we just said we were going to stop talking about, which is that's the second and third bullet point. One says it's residents, one says it's all. So which one was it?
So it's resident. The third bullet point should have been more explicit, that it's all resident individuals, households who file a personal income tax return would pay the EIT.
Okay, thank you.
And I just want to clarify that the last bullet point with all of the revenue streams would stay the same is within what you modeled, all the other revenue streams stay the same, but we would, of course, would be welcome to change the other revenue streams as a way of making.
Correct. Yeah, this is really just
describing what you're going to tell us.
The modeling that we've done based on what we interpreted to be committee request from 2 weeks ago. And these are all policy decisions, of course. But we needed to start the conversation somewhere. And I just wanted to know that this falls within the structure of option B. If you remember a few meetings back, I walked through those different big bucket potential structural options. This is within that option B structural option. And so moving on to slides 8 and 9 here. I'll start out on slide 8. This is a potential rate structure. We're calling it option 1A. And this bracket structure would raise approximately 400 million via the EIT and 60 million on the minimal homestead rate. And this 460 is ballpark about how much the net homestead property tax is. So we rounded it out to be a number that was easy to digest. We said, okay, 400 million raised with the education income tax, the remainder raised with the homestead rate. And so here we have the potential education income tax brackets on resident AGI. And we see, I can walk through it, or we can just look at the table and see that these are what the brackets would look like.
Is this, maybe you said this already, is this a marginal or effective?
Graham ran all of,
It's a marginal tax bracket structure.
Okay, thank you.
so Graham ran these brackets in Cambridge, raised the 400 million. And then we've got the homestead rates where the minimum is 13 cents and the average rate is 18 cents.
What's the average rate now? I don't have that on top of my head.
The average,
It's $1, right?
Or something.
The
average-
minimum is $1.
Yeah. Minimum is.
the average property tax rate, it's $1.40 this year, I think. $1.39, $1.40, somewhere in there.
I just love that Scott keeps that in his head. all the
I know, I
time.
knew he would.
Makes me happy every time.
Education property taxes that
Yeah.
combined.
That's it.
Average homestead education property tax this year is, I think it's $1.40. Average. Went down, because,
Right.
yeah,
Well, we'd love.
was up around $1.51.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Did you happen to look at this where we cap the $1 million income? That's always been something that surfaces, does somebody pay their 2.5% on all 10 million of their one big year when they sell their business, or you know what I mean?
$1.39.
So
I'm sorry, I was looking at Graham because he did the
Oh.
math. I should have been looking at you.
I
don't know
can't
that.
tell. I can't tell whether you're looking at me.
Yeah, sorry.
No, I did not. The modeling for the income tax year raised to 400 million does not include a cap on the max paid or the max income being subject to the tax. So another thing I just want to quickly point out for the committee here is you'll notice that married and head of household have the same bracket structure, and single and separate have the same structure. In the personal income tax rates, head of household has a sort of in between single and married filing joint bracket structure, but because the sort of the framework that we used for some of this modeling was the H911 from 2018, married and head of household were the same bracket structure in that bill. So if the committee wanted to, you could make head of household be sort of in between like it is with the personal income tax, but that's just something I want to flag for the committee that might look a little different if you were looking at personal income tax brackets, that married and head of household do not have the same bracket structure in the traditional personal income tax, but they did in H911. So just, I think maybe a potential question to sort of note or put in the parking lot if the committee decides to go forward on this.
Okay. Senator Perchlik.
And maybe another question for Graham. How did you decide, and maybe we decided this last time and told you, and I just don't remember, but why 400 million or this 390 million and or was it based on the percentages? Just, were you trying to hit some kind of number or impact on the filers, or?
So our guidance from the committee, my understanding from the October meeting, the previous meeting, was the goal was to raise enough on the education income tax combine and then leave a little bit left over for the homestead tax, such that the yield, we could get rid of the property tax credit and then have just a very, very small yield. And so it was Julia and I sort of professional judgment here that the yield would have to be quite small in order to achieve a situation where the lowest income groups or the lowest income groups amongst homeowners were going to be minimally impacted by removal of income sensitivity. And so it was our judgment to sort of say, okay, well, in order to achieve that, the amount that's going to have to be raised on this homestead tax that's left over is going to have to be pretty small. And we modeled sort of a lot of guess and checking here, but 400 million was roughly what we got to. But I think as Julia goes through the presentation, you'll see that we ran into issues even with the relatively small homestead tax.
You like this 25% is around that 450 million? Or
Yes. Exactly. So we're trying to raise enough to fill up that green box. And Graham and I were playing around a lot with the numbers and trying to figure out how it would shake out. So there would still be a minimal homestead rate in all towns. And it would be minimal. Which leads into option 1B, and we can certainly keep, these are all great questions in terms of understanding the structure. And it leads into option 1B, where after Graham figured out these brackets and we ran it through our models and looked at what it would look like across the different income ventiles for homestead property owners, we noticed that there was still a regressive nature at the lowest end of those income ventiles, which did not seem to be reflective of what the committee was asking for, which is why Graham went through and figured out a second potential rate structure, which is what we're looking at here in option 1B, which is a different set of brackets following all of the same assumptions. Everything that we've spoken about thus far is the same for option 1B as it is for option 1A, with the exception that you'll notice the ATI groups as well as the EIT rate is different than option 1A. So it's option 1A, option 1B, same structure, big picture. The only difference being that the rates and brackets are different.
You made a statement that 1A had regressivity in the lower area.
Yes.
Can you explain to me sort of how that's shown here?
Yes. So that's a really great teaser for a little bit later in the presentation, where we're going to walk through, what does this actually look like in terms of charts? I think we've got over 20 charts to show you. So you'll certainly see that, Representative Conlon.
I'm very excited. Thank you.
But right now we're really just understanding, what the structure is.
Okay, Representative Beck, then Senator Pearson.
Was there a yield that was calculated with 1A and 1B?
Yes. I would have to, I'll let you know when the committee breaks, but I did use the FY23 yield model and ran it through. So it has been adjusted by local spending decisions, but the yield is, as you would expect, very, very, very high.
Yeah, okay, all right, thanks.
And we had to, of course, bump down that minimum rate to 13 cents.
I probably we're going to get to this, so just tell me if this is premature, but when you say there ends up being some regressive dynamics at the lower end, a lot of sort of low and moderate income tax filers actually get refunds, right? Our structure is so progressive in the income tax. So is this, once you run these models and you have an obligation on the education income tax, is that refundable? Because I'm kind of guessing that the dynamic would be people get a smaller refund, but they still don't pay a bill. And I wonder how I'd like to understand that and if there were assumptions you made there.
I'm not sure about, I don't know the answer to your question. Graham may, Abby may, but what we're looking at here is really only the education income tax in the education fund. So we're not thinking about
Their tax bill,
their personal income tax, their returns, their refunds, earned income tax credit. We're not thinking about any of that. We're really just looking at, in the education fund, what an education income tax would look like.
That is an issue that's been flagged by Abby and as part of the tax department's report is can people file sort of at one time and not get sort of a payment in one place and a refund another place, but can they be integrated?
Thank you.
If I could jump in there, the modeling here, at least in terms of the total dollars raised, it doesn't necessarily matter whether things like the earned income tax credit can be applied against the education income tax or separately. I would just, as Julie talked about, the regressivity that we saw in some of this modeling is a function of both this minimal homestead yield plus this income tax. And generally, when we were doing the analysis of regressivity, we weren't looking at looping in the regular personal income tax as well, because I think that's a good principle to think about with the overall tax system, as we talked about, 2 meetings ago. A lot of the focus on whether the structure of any given education income tax or any sort of property tax system that the committee has looked at has focused kind of more closely on just the overall funding for schools or education tax. But it's an interesting point. The earned income tax credit for these people under, say, 30,000 married, it can be upwards of $1,000. So it could easily wipe out some of this education income tax if the committee decided to loop this tax into sort of the existing personal income tax framework.
Thanks.
Okay, so moving on. And this is the last structural slide that I have prepared for we have prepared for option 1. I'm on slide 10. And this is talking a little bit about that notion of a flexible lever education fund. So as we've spoken about, the education fund is unique, where the expenditures or the uses are set. And then as it is now, we set the yields and the non-homestead rate to raise sufficient funds to fund those uses. So in this option, the homestead rate will be maintained as a flexible lever because you're maintaining this flexible homestead rate. But because it's so minimal, it will raise a significantly smaller portion of required revenues. So this will likely increase volatility in the education fund because the homestead rate is going to be raising so much less. So to address this potential volatility or potential mismatch in terms of revenues, there's 2 options that we just wanted to have you thinking about or aware of. The size of the education fund reserve could be increased, or there could be an additional reserve. And this reserve could be used as a flexible lever to adjust for potential surpluses and deficits.
And that, I think, is based on the assumption that we want to maintain the protection that the ed fund has had now from swings in the economy, whereas other state funds have to absorb
Exactly.
when revenue disappears.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So because school districts set those budgets need to be funded as that's the current structure. Of course, that's also a policy decision, but that's the current structure. So that money needs to be raised somehow. And the other option, and this would be consistent with current law, would be to maintain that non-homestead rate as a flexible lever. But if it were to be the only flexible lever, then that non-homestead rate would be a lot more volatile than it is currently, because it would be the only flexible lever accounting for the differences that need to be made up.
We have a recession and the income drops significantly, then that homestead property tax would have to go up to raise that amount of money.
There'd be a bigger hole, so to speak, that non-homestead would need to fill. And the converse is also true, right? If incomes are way up, then there would be a much smaller hole that the non-homestead would.
Depending on local spending decisions.
Exactly, thank you.
So on the slide B, it talks about maintaining the non-homestead, but I thought that was part of option 1, that it was maintained, but this makes it seems like, oh, you could maintain it. Wasn't the modeling done as if it was there?
Yes, so the modeling assumed that everything, including the non-homestead, was maintained. We just included this as an option or a consideration of addressing volatility, because it's important to keep in mind how the volatility within the education fund would change with this structure and how the non-homestead rate would be used if this option were to be adopted.
But it would just be more variable.
Yes. Okay, great. So
Excuse me.
that closes out what we've prepared in terms of going over the structure of option one. So before I move on to the next option, are there any other remaining questions about the structure of option one? Okay, not seeing any. Then we're going to move on to option two. And this option is to completely eliminate the homestead property tax and fully replace it with an education income tax. So this was what was talked about in option C of that potential structures presentation a few meetings ago. But essentially the way that it would work is the homestead property tax would be eliminated. So would income sensitivity. And then to make up that, let's call it $460 million that needs to be made up, it would be made up by an education income tax, which would be added to the ed fund. So the EIT would have progressive income brackets and would be a tax on resident AGI. So this is similar to what we were just talking about in option one, with the difference being that now there's no homestead property tax. All of the same discussion that you've had thus far about resident AGI, that applies here as well. So we've modeled it based on what we were understanding the committee was interested in looking at. And the education income tax rates would be, this is that local, the connection to local spending decisions right here. So the EIT rates would be adjusted by district based on those locally voted education spending per equalized pupil. So that's currently the metric that rates are adjusted by, but currently it's the homestead property rates that are adjusted by ed spending per equalized pupil. Now it would be the education income tax rates that would be adjusted by ed spending per equalized pupil. And the way that they would be adjusted is they would be, this final bullet point is a little misleading. Rates would be either increased or decreased by the same percentage that locally voted ed spending per equalized pupil was greater or less than the statewide average. So rates would change either up or down by the same percentage that locally voted ed spending per pupil was different than the statewide average. And my laptop is, there we go, okay. And I will talk a little bit more about how that would actually shake out with the percentage in a couple of slides. But first, moving on to slide 12. Once again, we're looking at the brackets that Graham was able to calculate using Cambridge. And because of some modeling, it's really difficult when modeling with these numbers to hit a very specific number. So the brackets that we're looking at here raise 465 million instead of the 460, because it's a lot easier for me to work in the yield model and get down to the little nitty gritty. And so these brackets you'll see are following a similar structure than we were looking at for option one, and can be interpreted in the same way. And so, hold on.
Julia, can I just jump in real quick here?
Please.
I want to flag a sort of a general observation here as the committee looks at these brackets. You'll notice that these sort of, at least in these brackets, that the rate is, I won't say high, but it starts out at a sort of 1.5 and then it sort of goes up relatively incrementally from there. And I want to flag for the committee that when you're trying to raise significant amounts of money, like in the order of, $460 million, you have to set the lower brackets sort of quote unquote higher, because everybody goes through those bottom brackets. So, even if you're making $10 million, if you're making $100,000, everyone goes through that first set of brackets. And so if we're trying to raise money, just if the committee doesn't necessarily like the rates that were chosen here, be mindful of the fact that cutting rates sort of at the bottom under 60,000 by even a quarter of a percentage point, quote unquote, costs a lot of money, and vice versa. If you increase those by even a little bit, you get a lot more sort of bang for your buck. And so I didn't want to give the committee the impression that JFO was sort of sitting here going, oh, well, we need to make the rates nice and high for those people under 60. It's just that when you're trying to raise this kind of order of magnitude of dollars, you have a relatively higher amount at the lower incomes in order to generate it.
We're still talking about marginal rates here, right, Graham?
That's correct. Yeah, these are marginal.
All right. Okay.
Senator Peterson?
I'm thinking about this compared to the first model and wondering that the idea of a very low homestead rate that then gets adjusted locally. To me, well, I'm still can't get my head around what happens if we don't adjust rates, but I guess I'm wondering if it's such a low rate, is a local adjustment meaningful? In other words, it becomes just I would guess, not something people would feel. Part of the idea of the adjustment is to have some connection to your vote and those spending decisions locally. And have you guys thought through that?
Yeah,
You're
so
smiling, so
once
maybe
again,
yes.
great teaser for this afternoon.
Okay.
Or for later in the slide deck, depending on how quickly we move through. But we do have a section later in the day that's talking exactly about that, about skin in the game, cost containment, and how much is enough for the committee.
Okay.
And if I vote my school budget in March, am I going to pay that income tax on that budget in April? Or do we have a year's delay because some of us have paid our income tax?
So that is another, I know I keep saying this, that's another policy decision. There's a lot of questions about how this would work because we're examining a new tax.
No one has done this before, is that correct? Are we continuing our tradition?
We are.
Yes, so.
What is the TV show, Brave?
We're going from one-off system to possibly another one-off system.
But that's an administrative decision that we can sort of.
Yes,
think
that
about.
is.
Yes.
But yes.
So they're all great questions and we can keep them in the parking lot. They certainly will need to be addressed at some point. But really we've been looking at the sort of the big structural picture considerations modeling. So moving on from these potential brackets, I'm going to slide 13. And this is talking about, what would a change in the education income tax based on locally voted spending decisions look like. So we're just going to assume, because it's an easy round number, that the statewide average education spending per equalized pupil is 20,000. That's in FY22, the average was about 18,500. So we're going to assume that the statewide average is 20,000, and we're going to just look at solely for exemplary purposes the lowest income brackets that we just looked at for married filers. So I'm looking at that little table, the black and white one, table 4. And you can see that's really just pulled from the previous slide in terms of what the brackets look like. And now we're going to look at the adjustments of the tax rate and how that would actually work. So in table 5, the green one. So I've got 3 example districts here. And all of these, we're going to assume that we're only looking at these districts, and we're going to assume that in District A has an education spending per equalized pupil of 15,000, B 20,000 and C 25,000. So you can see that District B, I'm moving on to the third column here, is 100%. It matches the statewide average. District A is 75% of the statewide average, and District B is 125% of the statewide average. So this is going to be what is used to adjust those tax rates. So moving on to the fourth column, adjustment to tax rates, we'll look at how the brackets will be adjusted. So looking in District A, the lowest bracket, we know that that marginal tax rate is 1.5%. It's going to be multiplied by 0.75 because it's 75% of the statewide average, right? So 1.5% times 0.75 or times 75% gives us a decrease in that tax rate to 1.13%, which it would be the spending adjusted tax rate. The same logic would be for the second lowest bracket. The tax rate, the EIT rate multiplied by 75%, which would bring it down to 1.31%. District B, we see that there's no adjustment because they're right at that statewide average. And District C, similar, but this time because they're spending 125% of the statewide average, those rates are going to be adjusted up proportionately. So the lowest bracket multiplied by 1.25 or 125% bumps that rate up. Same within the second lowest bracket. Any questions about that?
Not being a math person, but the math all works. In other words, you still raise the same or the amount of money you need to raise.
So that's another great.
Okay.
You all just keep, you know where we're going. So that's another question that comes back to that question of how do you make sure that the education fund is squared away, right? And we do have a couple of similar options that we present, or similar choices that we presented in option one. But that raises a very interesting and important consideration if the committee were to decide to go with option two. That being said, the education fund is unique in the sense that uses are set and then revenues are raised accordingly. So it wouldn't be a new construct to do something like the general fund where we don't necessarily know exactly how much revenue is going to come in. It would be something that would be forecasted. I see Graham popped up. He probably wants to add something.
I would just to speak to the representative's question a bit more. It's just that Julia raises the point that you do have uncertainty that's being created here. I mean, so what we are modeling here and the money that's being raised under option two, the 465 million, is using the statewide, or looking at every single town and how much they spend relative to the current state average for per pupil spending. And so long as that distribution of towns is somewhat reflective, then, you know, this is a good modeling exercise. But suppose, you know, next year, the schools all of a sudden bunched closer to the statewide average, then I think you would see a decrease in revenue because the rates here are proportionally higher or lower depending upon that distribution of the towns and how much they spend per pupil. So if you can think of this kind of in the way I thought about it, and the way Julie and I have been talking about it, as a base bracket that we have on slide 12 that is adjusted by per pupil spending. And these 465 million that we've raised in this exercise is using the current per pupil spending by town. But to the extent that that distribution changes, you might raise more or less money in a given year. Okay. In addition to the traditional dynamics about income volatility and things like that.
And I just, on top of that, want to remind the committee that currently it's districts that vote their budgets, and then that is prorated out to towns. So that ed spending per equalized pupil by town, we've backed into based on what districts they're a part of, to what extent.
Okay. Senator Pearson, you had a...
Wouldn't we have a similar dynamic to what we have now where, you know, basically the the ed fund pressure is settled in March and then the legislature reacts and sets the yield, wouldn't we be doing something similar where we would make it 1.52 and then I guess I'm not understanding what Graham just said about, this, you presented it as a risk of us not getting it right. And maybe that's a timing of some of the decisions that I'm not understanding.
I think that the nuance here is that we're not working off of a yield.
Yeah.
So the way that the current system works is we have a yield that.
Because we know the grand list is a fixed thing.
So that's one of the things I'm also doing right now is I'm building the yield model and I'm pulling in the equalized grand list from the tax department and school districts, all of the school district data, pulling it all together so that once all school district budgets come in March in town meeting, we have a really, really good idea of exactly what is going on in the state. And then those yields are set to make sure that we're raising the amount of money that needs to be raised.
Under this, we would be estimating what incomes will be.
Yes.
We'd still be tweaking it, but it would be based on a forecast. Yeah, okay.
Yes. So if I can just quickly clarify what I said. So under this system, you have, I think, two areas of uncertainty. So you have incomes go up and down every given year, right? And so you can forecast that. But then you will not know until after town meeting what you should set the ratios at for this bracket. So you'll always have a base bracket here, which is on slide 12. But then that base bracket is adjusted up and down depending upon what the school spending is. And so you have another layer of uncertainty on top of that. So to Senator Pearson, I think you could, in theory, do kind of what you do now if you sort of the forecast came in after town meeting that we were going to be raising way less than what we needed for the ed fund. One option that you could do is you could adjust the base bracket numbers upwards. So instead of a 1.5% rate for the lowest bracket, it could be 1.55 to raise the money. So you could adjust that base bracket just similarly to how you adjust the yield, but you still would have that income uncertainty there. So you're kind of always in a forecasting scenario with option 2 and in a lesser effect option 1 as well.
And just remind me, the current income sensitized universe, which is a huge portion of looking at their last year's income. So we don't have the volatility that we're describing now, right?
Yeah, so the property tax credit is based on last year's data. So there's a lag.
Yeah, okay.
And it might be helpful for people who are more visual. We do have what we're talking about laid out actually on the next couple of slides. So slide 15 is really just.
Had one of the issues we dealt with, we tried school consolidation, was that for poorer towns, even though it all goes through the mixing block and a penny on the tax rate raises the same amount, those poorer towns are much less likely to vote the increased spending because they're poor. And a penny on the tax rate, we've got some school buildings and things that really need some maintenance put into them, but the town has a difficult time because the residents are poor. I'm not sure that, and I've heard this will be the next Brigham court case. I'm not sure that this doesn't exacerbate that too. That, if I'm seeing an increase in my income tax, and everyone will pay this, right? Maybe kind of if you get an EITC, earned income, we might be able to integrate it, but it will impact that lower bracket and could influence On the other hand, they could say, well, the rich people are going to pay for it anyway. But I doubt that.
It's certainly an interesting consideration and
That's all true right now.
Exactly.
Yeah,
policy
it is.
question in terms of what this committee is hoping to change and or achieve.
I think it's
If you were to want to go down this route.
Personal psychology as to how we make those decisions. Sometimes
Yeah.
most people just look at the bottom line and see what the increase is and say.
I mean, the rich people who don't have kids in school might decide to show up and vote down school taxes.
I feel like I can get my head around the philosophy of this a little bit better once I look at the graphs around impact.
Okay, let's keep going, but
Okay.
If I could add one thing to speak to Senator Cummings as well, I don't exactly know how much the tax rate responds in any given town whenever a district increases its per pupil spending. But one thing that's unique about this design is that the effect on the tax rate and therefore someone's tax liability is going to be linear depending upon what their spending is. So if a school district increases their spending by 10% more than the statewide average, then their rates go up by 10%, and vice versa on the other side. I'm not saying that doesn't solve the problem that you're speaking to, Senator Cummings, but the effect on the tax rate and what people pay is always going to be equal or linear depending upon what their school spending is. Rather, in the current system with the mix of income sensitivity, the effect on the tax rate may not actually be as linear. So if a town spends 10% more, the effect on the tax rate may be more or less than 10%.
okay.
And one quick question on that, right? Just to make sure I understand this right. Right now, if we did this right now, we would know what the average is at town meeting. I mean, you would know what the average proposed is because you have what was before the voter. So if you took the average of what was proposed, so when you go to vote, you would know what the average might be. Basically.
Yeah, you don't know what the average is till everybody votes.
Right, but you know what the average kind of proposal is. I don't know how much it changes on a statewide basis, how much that number changes, but you would have an idea or a likely idea how your school budgets, if it's above the average or below the average, or above or below the proposed average, right?
You're talking about per pupil spending.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that would be another policy question. Would the average be this year's average? Would it be a look back to last year's average so that it would be more explicit? That's another policy question. With respect to, I'm on slide 16, and this is talking about, the flexible levers and what Graham was mentioning, which is adjusting the EIT rates. That's option C here. If the committee were to think about or decide to adjust the EIT rates to raise sufficient revenues, then it may be less explicit what the tax rate change would be. If that makes sense.
Okay. And this is going to be a separate, you're already paying a percentage. I'm wondering, how is this going to hit? Is this just going to be added on and said, our top tax rates are higher than anyone else's because will this be figured into it when all those national people, we know we have a problem because a lot of schools are done at the county level or there's county taxes and we don't have that. It's all state. So is that going to?
I don't know how those different organizations that rate states based on taxes, how they
hate taxes.
Swapping one for another.
And I would also remind the committee of what we were talking about. I think it was the last meeting or maybe the meeting before that, when Graham was talking about, there's two different ways of looking at taxes, right here, we're only looking at the education income tax. But then if you're looking at the total tax incidence, the total tax burden, and where you start stacking them on top of each other, it's two different
It's two numbers.
ways of looking at it.
I would say no, because whenever you pick up one of those reports, it doesn't say what the local income taxes are. And we have those all over the country.
That's great.
This
But if I may, would still be a statewide.
isn't a local tax,
But we wouldn't,
It's
I think,
locally determined. The rate is locally
Right.
determined.
but it isn't, it's a state. It's a,
Just have to be asterisks on the
Yeah.
Vermont chart.
it's a charge on your
They'd have to care
state
about.
income tax.
There will not, under this proposal, there would not be a statewide education income tax rate. That would not
But
exist.
there isn't in any other state either. That's what we get into.
No, but it's not a statewide income tax rate. It's a local income tax rate.
But it's a statewide income
Base.
tax.
Yeah, well, anyway.
I think that this speaks to the same nuance that exists in the current system, right? Where we've got these locally adjusted homestead rates that are all contributing to the statewide pot to then go back and fund all the districts. So it's,
And they don't show up in those reports either.
okay.
But, yeah, because we're unique and we're just going to another unique system, but we have to keep that redistribution in order to meet Brigham. Because if you just went, if it was truly a local income tax, then wealthy towns could raise a lot of money with a lower tax rate than a poor town.
and I don't think anyone's considering
No, I
doing
don't
that.
think they are either.
No. Are we ready for section C, Julia?
Yeah. Should
I'm super psyched for graphs.
we move on?
Okay, we'll get on to the graphs.
Okay, so section C. Starts on slide 17. But hopping in slide 18. This is one of those, starts talking to one of those big questions that I brought up in the beginning of today's meeting. That an education income tax for all resident income filers would significantly expand the number of people who are paying a direct education tax.
Julia, I know that you're going to use the same colors on all of our graphs throughout all 50 slides. Could you explain those colors to us as you're
So
Thank you.
here, it's a little bit less,
Did I pick the wrong one to ask you that?
yes, but that's okay. We've tried to use the colors so that it's easier to move through the graphs. So this one is sort of an independent standalone graph, so you can't really interpret the colors here, but moving forward, you'll see that whenever we're looking at current law, it's always going to be light blue. Whenever we're looking at an income tax, it's always going to be dark blue, that kind of a thing. So both option 1 and option 2 would expand the direct education tax to all resident income filers. And the number of resident income tax filers is approximately double the number of homestead households. So approximately 170,000 of homestead households pay the homestead property tax, and there's approximately 325,000 returns for the income tax. So this results in the difference of approximately 155,000 individuals, households. And if you're looking at the chart here on the right, you'll see the red box, and this is almost 75% of this discrepancy that I'm talking about is concentrated in this AGI group under 47,000. And this is one of those big outstanding questions, is trying to understand who these 155,000 air quote additional folks are. So I'm moving on to slide 19. Understand the difference in these numbers. right? So this difference in filers represents multiple different groups, and there would be a significant number of people who would be newly responsible for a direct education tax as compared to current law. If you were to move forward with an education income tax. While it represents a wide group of potential people, the biggest likely group would be renters. All income filers, so the 155,000 are all income filers who are not homestead owners. There's also could be people in there who should be but are not filling out a homestead declaration. There could be multiple filers who are living within a single household, homestead household. So all of it would be included in household income, but it would only be one homestead.
How do you or does tax get their head around how many folks might be married filing separate or domestic partners filing separately?
I can maybe help answer that question. So I guess knowing how many, so the issue here is we might have homestead or people paying the homestead tax that have two people living in the same house. They filed their household income, but when they file their personal income tax return, they show up as two different people as opposed to one. Yeah. And that's the group that we're talking about here. We don't have that many married filing separate returns in Vermont. I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 30,000 returns are married filing separate. Yeah, it's not a significant amount. This is definitely a group that's in here in this sort of unknown group that Julie and I are talking about. But after talking it over with Jake Feldman at the tax department, it's definitely not zero, but it is, I don't think it explains, a significant portion of the 155,000 we're talking. To give you a sense, and Julia will go over this later, but, we know from the census that there are about 75-ish thousand renter households in Vermont. And so those might have separate returns. So that number could be pretty significant, but the married filing separate group is there, but I don't think it's significant. It could explain a significant portion of the filers here.
Thanks.
Okay.
Can you explain that third bullet point, the people who should but aren't filing a declaration?
So right now, people, if they have a homestead, they need to file the homestead declaration. So this bullet is capturing the folks that either don't know that they need to be filing a homestead declaration and thus are not included in our data set as being homestead owners.
They're still paying, they're just paying the non-homestead.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And in some towns, that's not allowed, but is done because the non-homestead rate is lower.
Right.
Yep.
So it could be folks who aren't aware. It could be folks who are actively making a decision to break the law.
Just to add some color to that, speaking to Jake as well on this one, we don't believe that group of people is particularly large either.
Right. I would assume.
Just comparing the number of homestead declarations that we have compared to the amount of reported census households or house sites, owner occupied homes in Vermont, the difference is not significant or not. It's in, I think, somewhere around 10,000 if I remember right, but it's not, it's not like we have this group out there that's these households that are, 50,000 households aren't filing household declarations. It's just that's a group that it will theoretically, and there probably are some that are filing personal income tax returns, but just have not filed a homestead declaration.
So we really think this second bullet point under who might this wide group of people, we really think that the biggest likely group is renters. But this is a data challenge here for us to understand going back to those mismatched data sets that I was talking about in the beginning.
Okay.
Sorry, Julia, can I add one more thing here?
Yes, please.
To keep interrupting. So on the previous slide, Julia talked about that, 75% of this group we think is coming from the under $47,000 group. And while we think a lot of this group is renters, I think the second biggest group is likely this last bullet point, students or other young people who are, working, they have enough money to file a tax return. They, have a sort of alternative living arrangement, maybe living with their parents or living in a dorm. But they have a relatively small amount of income, but enough to file. And so we'll talk a lot about renters in a future slide, but I would say, don't necessarily think of this 0 to 47,000 group as, a quote unquote traditional low income household. It could just be a significant number of them might just be students who have summer jobs, stuff like that they're required to file a personal income tax return. And that's the amount of AGI they have. So there's without question low income filers in there, but I don't want to sort of make the committee, significantly worried about the number of potential new taxpayers here that are under 47. They would be sort of seasonal type employees, students, aside from the renters.
Migrant workers. Okay.
Thank you, Pam. So this brings us to slide 20, which is one of these really big takeaways that I said I was going to keep referencing. The less that's raised by one tax base, one group, the more that needs to be raised by another. So all of our modeling assumes that the same amount of revenues need to be raised that are currently being raised under the entire net homestead property tax, that 460 million that we're just kind of using
These rates, if we needed to raise 500 million, the rates would have to go up.
Correct.
To cover that.
Correct. And really for our modeling purposes and what we're going to be looking at moving forward, we're assuming that we're only talking about this 460 million to see how things would shift between groups. And this reflects a zero-sum game, right? So the less that's being raised by some folks, the more that's going to be raised by other folks, because the total amount of money needs to be raised somewhere. And so both option one and option two, as we've spoken about so far, and we're going to look into more charts in the upcoming sections, expand the education tax base and expand the number of people who would be paying. So this really comes down to two groups that need to be analyzed. First, the people who own homestead property and are currently taxed. So they're currently paying that direct education tax. We also need to look at the people who do not own homestead property, so currently are not paying a direct homestead education tax. And it ultimately comes up to being a policy decision as to where are the priorities, who should be paying and how much. So teaser for this afternoon, for later this morning and this afternoon, we're going to look at these two groups individually. So first we're going to look at what might this look like for homestead property owners, and we'll see that a lot of the effective tax rates, average tax, it's going down because more people are going to be paying a direct education tax. And then later we're going to be looking at the people who do not own homestead property, so currently are not paying that direct tax. And we have less data, so we have fewer charts to show for that group. But it's not an attempt by us to give them less airtime, but just we can't dive into that group as deeply.
I'm an individual. I own a business building. I also own a house. Now I'm going to be paying on my income, or say I'm a non-resident and I own a business property. I'm now going to be paying an income tax on that income that I've earned in Vermont, the rent I'm getting, or, for that property. Plus, I'm going to be paying the non-property tax rate on that building.
Yeah, so.
Okay.
So these options are not, I'm not sure if I understood your question, so feel free to jump in if you want to, Graham. The way that I understand the question is non-homestead tax, we have not modeled a change in that. So that's going to be staying the same under all of the scenarios that we're looking at. As for the education income tax, that's being expanded to all residents.
Okay, so if I'm
So if you're a resident, you'll be paying that education income tax.
based on that income plus any other, plus I will be paying if I own a bunch of rental properties, I will pay on my income, plus I will pay the non-homestead property rate on all of those. Okay.
It's the same way right now you pay a homestead and a non-homestead
Right.
separately.
Right.
And if it was corporate income that the rental properties were, then that would be different than if
That's
you,
in
I
the
mean, it depends on
corporate
how you
income
structured
tax.
your, profit.
But more
Yes.
than likely, it's an LLC or,
But
Even then, it
yeah.
would,
then
even
you
then,
pay
it wouldn't be part of your personal
Right,
income tax.
then you pay it.
you're not going to pay on the income from that rental unit. You're going to pay on the net income from that rental.
Yes.
unit. That's a big difference.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So so I would say the first test here is if you're a non-resident, right? Then under current law, you would pay the non-homestead tax on that rental property. And then if that income is derived from Vermont, then you would pay personal income tax on that Vermont derived income. But under this new system that you would pay non-homestead tax like you did under current law, but because the education income tax in both of these options we're talking about today is only on residents, then you would not be responsible for paying the education income tax on the Vermont derived income from your rental property.
Okay. But that if we change that would come into play. Okay.
Right. That goes back to the sort of the first 2 or 3 slides that Julia spoke about is who should be paying this tax, right? Do you believe that someone who is non-resident, who has Vermont-based rental income, is someone who should be contributing towards the education of the state? And the same question goes for, students living in dorms or renters.
I mean, we already have established that folks who own property here, even if they're non-resident, should be paying towards the education of the students of the state. So that's something we're already doing.
So just a quick tax question. Does business loss for a sole proprietor, does business loss flow through to Vermont AGI, Graham?
It does. Well, so if a business reports a negative net income, then yes, that is part of AGI. Yeah. So whatever net income is. So if net income's negative, that's part of their AGI. Or if net income is positive. Yeah, exactly.
All right.
Okay, let's keep going.
All right, well, that concludes the section C.
Time for a break.
Sorry?
For a break.
Those are great.
Okay, let's have a break. The questions I have so far are the one on non-residents is the big one. And then I have one other. Oh, the integration question, can it be integrated into your entire tax? So you don't have to pay this and then get it back. And
I also have questions about the bracket categories.
Right.
And then which average that we would look to, past years, current year, all of that.
And the timing issue, this year, last year, what income, what school budgets. Okay. How long a break have we got scheduled?
We don't.
20 minutes.
20 minutes.
I don't know.
Whoa.
We need that much time?
We don't need.
I'll make it 10.
Yeah, let's do